More Than Physics. And we have our moderator, which I asked to come on stage, Sandy Bisaro. Sandy Bisaro is a senior researcher at the Global Climate Forum. He's a member of the management committee of the Sea Level Rise Knowledge Hub, and most particularly looking in the policy side, so the policy task group. Thanks a lot, and the floor is yours to manage this interesting session.
Great, thanks very much, Petra. Good morning, everyone, and yeah, welcome to the session, More Than Physics. This is sort of moving from the last day and a half from the physical sciences and coastal impacts to kind of policy and governance of adaptation responses. Yeah, my name is Sandy Bisaro. I've kind of been working for many years at the Global Climate Forum on coastal governance issues from a social science perspective. And I'm very happy to be moderating this session, which gets at kind of the core aims of the Sea Level Rise Knowledge Hub that we've been discussing in the last few days, integrating kind of policy and science for decision making, but it comes at it, I would say, from a different perspective rather than starting from the sciences and uncertainties and trying to make those precise. Here in this session, what we'd like to do is start from the decision making and policy side and try to unpack what kind of decision-making approaches are kind of appropriate, available in different contexts at different scales. What kind of governance challenges arise in trying to implement adaptation at different scales, social acceptance, how do we deal with kind of stakeholder conflicts or different interests at the coast in implementation, and kind of what are the characteristics for designing and implementing successful co-design or adaptation processes to kind of overcome some of these barriers. We have 3 speakers, each speaking to those different issues, followed by a panel similar to the other sessions. So at this point, I will stop and hand over to our first speaker, Jochen Hinkel, who will speak about decision making under uncertainty. Thanks, Jochen.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm speaking about decision sciences. My name is Jochen Hinkel. I'm based at the Global Climate Forum together with Sandy in Berlin. And yeah, I have the pleasure to speak about decision sciences. And actually, this relates very well to the discussion we had at the end of the last panel. So decision science is between the sea level rise physics, the natural science aspects, the digital twins and all that, the integrated models, and decision-making and stakeholders. What is it, page down? Yes. Importantly, decision science has 2 sides. It has a prescriptive side, addressing the question how to best make decisions in face of sea level rise, for example. And it also has a descriptive side, addressing the question, how are decisions or policies actually made in the real world? And as you will see, those 2 perspectives will differ, and the strength of decision science lies in integrating those 2 perspectives. So let me first say a couple of words on the prescriptive side of decision sciences. This is about how to make best decisions, and best here means best from the perspective of the stakeholders or decision makers, given their preferences. So it's not meant to prescribe what others should do, it's just going to help people to find or to really get what they want. This comprises many disciplines, some of which are called decision analysis, risk management, decision support, operations research, etc. And importantly, it has 2 integral parts. One is about the analytics, so those are computational mathematical methods in order to find the right solution given our preferences. And the second is about process, about facilitating the process of decision making and integrating stakeholders in that. I'm more going to speak about the first part, the analytical part, simply because of time. Importantly, there we don't have a one-size-fits-all method. There are many methods for decision-making, and what is important to note is that the applicability of the method really depends on the context. So all of those methods have their justification and they fit to a particular decision and particular kind of context. And what is important is to select the method that suits this context. Furthermore, the method applied then has indications on what kind of information I need. For example, on what kind of sea level rise information I need. That's the way you do decisions from a decision analytical perspective. And from a sort of sea level rise perspective, we often start at the wrong end, namely with the sea level rise information. Let me first introduce a simple context that we often find in coastal adaptation decision making. So we often have long time horizons, long-lasting options. If you think about coastal protection infrastructure or also land use planning, they have indications for decades, if not centuries to come. We have large uncertainties, I think we all understand that, but we also have the situation of significant learning. And this is more subtle, rarely brought explicitly to the table, so let me explain what I mean by that. On the top figure, you see uncertainty seen from different moments in time about sea level rise in 2100. And that would be the situation if we wouldn't learn. If we would be in 2060, we would still assume sea level rise would have the same uncertainty range in 2100 as we have it today. And believe it or not, most decision-making methods use this kind of information for decision-making nowadays. Clearly, this is not the right approach. Rather, we are learning over time, and this is the picture below, where you see that the uncertainty range gets reduced as we proceed towards 2100. And in this context, so-called adaptive decision-making methods are very suitable. And just to give you the canonical example of one particular method, the Thames estuary barrier that protects London, there was one question raised whether there is actually sufficient time to adapt the barrier, because building barriers takes decades, in the case of high-end sea level rise. There were many questions raised. This is just one I'm picking upon right here. The method applied was adaptation pathway analysis, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that method. The core idea is you have on the x-axis the sea level rise, and then you have those blue boxes denoting the different measures, and the width of the measures denotes against which amount of sea level rise the measure is still effective. And so you sequence the measures you have on the table to make sure you have a sequence or a pathway of measures that can help you to protect even in the worst case to come. And for this kind of approach, an important ingredient is so-called high-end sea level rise scenarios. Let me give you another example, and let me add one criterion to the decision context, namely economics. Many infrastructure investments are done by public authorities, and hence they need to prove that they spend the money wisely. So money economics is important. A typical decision would be, for example, is it cheaper to adapt now or cheaper to wait until we know more about sea level and then adapt in, I don't know, 2050, 2060? This method can be addressed by a method called, this problem can be addressed by real option analysis. I'll spare you the technical details. It's a mathematical method. But what is important to note here is that we need specific kind of sea level rise information that hardly exists nowadays. We need learning scenarios. And those learning scenarios are sort of tree type of scenarios where you move from one time step to the next one, always on different pathways, and for each point in time you know exactly what may happen in the next time step. This is not how we have sea level rise information today, for example, through the IPCC, etc., and work needs to be done to develop these kinds of scenarios. Finally, let me add something beyond economics. Normally, it's not just money that is important for our decision, but many other things, such as happiness, such as biodiversity, such as distribution of effects over stakeholders, etc. And so we have methods to deal with it, and multi-criteria analysis is generally the keyword here. It includes many different methods. And for example, with that method, one can address the problem of how to prioritize erosion management for the 200 inhabited islands of the Maldives. And then you take those criteria, you combine those criteria depending on the preferences of the stakeholders, and you can come up with a ranking of the islands. Here, the method of analytical hierarchy process, a specific method was applied. Importantly, here we need much more information, not only on sea level rise, but we need waves, currents, etc., so everything influencing erosion. Also, it's much more near term, so we need to understand also ocean variability in order to get the near-term sea level rise projections. Let me now flip the coin and speak a couple of words about descriptive decision science. So this, again, addresses the question of how are policies and decisions actually made. This comprises a whole set of empirical social science disciplines, such as behavioral sciences, political sciences, institutional economics, etc. And we know there are many reasons why decisions taken in the real world differ from those ideal decisions we assess via prescriptive methods. And this includes things like cognitive biases, conflicting interests of stakeholders, institutional complexity, or the exercise of power. Let me just give you two examples here. One is coming back to the erosion problem of the Maldives. So this is the process, the policy process, how this erosion management works. It starts with islands reporting on erosion problems to the Environmental Protection Agency at the national level, which then applies the method I've just shown to prioritize islands. This goes to the President's office for approval, then the Parliament approves the budget, and then implementation starts. However, that's the theory. In reality, there's something happening in between, namely that there's political bargaining between the President, other MPs, and also the councils of different islands, and it's not clear what's happening exactly, but the list changes. And I'm not picking here on the Maldives because this is something that specifically happens in the Maldives. It happens everywhere in each country if money is involved in decision making. Let me give another example, institutional complexity. This is from a current European project, the West Coast project, where we look at financing nature-based solutions. And this picture, you're not supposed to read it, I can't read it either, but it shows you all the different actors involved in organizations in funding nature-based solutions. It shows you the benefits people obtain. It shows you the different ecosystem services provided by different nature-based solutions that go to different agents or different actors that benefit from them. And it also lists all the organizations involved in actually implementing the nature-based solutions. So here, descriptive decision science can help you to understand and appreciate the complexity of such situations. Let me conclude. So prescriptive decision science, it really helps us to make better decisions That means to get what we really want, given our preferences. And it also helps to better direct sea-level rise science towards producing the right information for that. It's not sea-level rise science that can decide what the right information is, it is decision-making. Descriptive decision science helps us to better understand and appreciate the complexity of real-world decision-making and to understand why things go wrong or work differently than the ideal situation suggests. And this can also actually help us to then improve the prescriptive methods we use for decision-making, because any decision-making needs to take into account how the real world operates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jochen. Right on time also. That's a very comprehensive view of decision-making from two different perspectives. We have time for questions from the audience. Please just stand and go to the microphones. Yes.
Can I go first?
Yes, please.
So Robert Nichols, just a very quick question about the issue of learning scenarios. And I was just going to ask the question about, what about, I accept what you say in general, but you may get shocks when uncertainty grows. So, for example, things like DeConto and Pollard, the instabilities in the Antarctic, you might actually find that over time your uncertainties grow, then they might start diminishing again. Does that actually affect your arguments, that sort of shock of new information that might be a new uncertainty?
Thanks, Robert. No, it does not. I was speaking about learning through observations when considering the same point in time of which I'm assessing the uncertainty. So it's really clear that the uncertainty in 2100 seen from today is larger than seen from 2060. Beyond that, things that you suggest happen, but this is then an additional feature.
Jochen, your last bullet point, I think, is extremely important about the possibility of using what you learn from observation for revising, I would say, or defining methods for prescriptive approach. Do you think this is possible in general? So is there a way, for example, to approach, because there is a never-ending debate about the decision support system, if they are useful or not, if information is an alternative, etc. But do you think it's possible to really learn about even many informal approaches to decision-making and somehow implementing them in some prescription for improved decision-making? Thank you.
Thanks, Carlo. Yes, indeed, I think it's possible. And just to give you one example, I think it's more about the process, so the decision-making process. And for example, by looking at the complexity of real-world decision-making processes, we can better identify those stakeholders that we need to include into a prescriptive decision-making process, for example.
Well, I'm the bureaucrat in the room, and so my question, you see, I was former ambassador of the sea, and I had to chair terrible problems inside the German authorities and the conflict between different agencies, where myself as a diplomat, I was the head of delegation, but I couldn't leave the room because there were different agencies. And so the question is, can you measure the loss of energy in this type of conflicts, of objectives, or of implementation? I was speaking about the problem between the Federal Agency of Environmental Things, who had a responsibility for Southern Ocean, but not for the Baltics and the North Sea. And the methods in North Sea and Baltic Sea were not the same as what has done, and they went to court. That two federal agencies were fighting in Berlin before the administrative court to see who is right. And I had to intervene the German federal president to call in both agencies and to say, well, Germany is Germany, and we have to take a decision. But this is not the only case I have seen in my 6 years term in this type of responsibilities. I saw a lot of very conflicts which were not worth conflict. It was more a fight between personalities and so on, and I had to bang the heads of both to say, well, now we have to continue and do something for the future. Every project you are doing to protect against floods and inundation and sea level rise, you have to go into concrete. And if you come with a precautionary principle, you can delay it for 20 years.
Yes, well, first of all, thanks for sharing your experience in real-world policy making. And this is, as I understand, the normal situation, no? You have fights, interests, and, my answer, actually, my discipline, institutional economics, actually measures the energy used for such political bargaining and resolving conflicts and going to court, etc. It's not called energy here, it's called transaction cost in economics. And this is what people actually try to understand. So are the transaction costs higher for a certain institutional or bureaucratic setup than for another one? And there are answers that can be given to that.
Thanks. I think we can take just one more question because we have to move on. We will have a final Q&A at the end where you can save your questions and come back to Jochen. But yes, please, at this mic, the last question.
Okay, we had a small negotiation on the question. I won. I'm not sure whether Bart had exactly the same question, but at some stage you argued that the IPCC was not providing the right information to feed into your learning scenarios. Can you elaborate on what is the type of information you would like to see being produced by IPCC?
Yes, first of all, one can develop learning scenarios from the type of information that is available, but more ideally, one would need complete sets of trajectories over time from integrated models having all the components of sea level rise. I know that is not possible. We add those components from separate models, but this is basically what one would need in order to get information not about the likely range or probabilistic range in the future, but in order to get information on how we move from one particular sea level rise at one particular point in time, say 2050 and 30 centimeters, to sea level rise in 2080. That's really what we would like to have, and I'm happy to discuss how to get that.
Great, thank you very much. Jochen, thank you for the interesting questions and discussion. Let's move on now to our next keynote speaker who will join us remotely. This is Bruce Glavovic, who's going to speak about the politics of adaptation, so shifting from decision making to now, some of the issues we touched on also in this last Q&A. So Bruce, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours. You're muted, actually. We cannot hear you yet. Still no. You want to try again? We don't hear you yet, just... There's a suggestion to remove your earphones, but...
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Great.
Okay, apologies for that. It was working a very short while ago. I understand that the PowerPoint slides will be shown on the screen there. I'm calling in from Brazil and the connection is not fantastic. Are the PowerPoints being shown there, or should I share my screen?
We don't have your slides up, so please share your screen there. Now there's, yeah, now the slides are up.
Right, are you able to see my screen and the PowerPoint now?
We have the titles slide on the screen here, yes.
Okay, so my focus is on empowering governance to tackle sea level rise, and I'm going to be sharing some reflections from New Zealand. This is a slide just signaling an overview of the brief comments that I'm going to make. I'm just going to explain a few terms that I will use. I will briefly touch on enabling conditions for governance in responding to sea level rise, provide a little more context about New Zealand, give you a couple of case studies, some high-level observations before some final reflections. So just in terms of some key concepts, I'm using the word governance as distinct from government, and I'm referring to those societal interactions that produce choices and actions or inactions in society. And those societal interactions are between different levels of government, the private sector and civil society, those actors literally from the local to global level. Why empowering governance, and what relevance does this have to sea level rise? So sea level rise risk is simply put hazard, exposure and vulnerability, and in the bottom right hand corner the very well known IPCC reflection of that risk. And so empowering governance is governance that addresses the drivers and root causes of poverty, marginalization, and so forth. In short, reduces social vulnerability and intends to produce outcomes that are more equitable and just over time. And one can think of this in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals as one sort of global roadmap towards outcomes that have positive outcomes for people and the planet over time. So in short, an empowering governance approach reduces sea level rise risk. So if we go on to look at some of these enabling governance conditions for how we might respond to sea level rise, and drawing from the sea level rise chapter in the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, and further work in work group 2 in the chapter on cities and settlements by the sea, we recognize that sea level rise and how we respond to it involves deep complexity. Cause and effect are interconnected, there's dynamism, emergent properties, and so forth. So if we're going to engage with that deep complexity in a meaningful way, we need to leverage multiple knowledges, science, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and so forth. And part of the challenge is to build institutional capabilities that enable us to tackle this complexity. And by institution, I'm referring to institutions in a sociological sense, in the sense of those regulatory and non-regulatory norms and rules that shape how we make the societal choices. Another feature of sea level rise and the responses to it relates to the long time horizon involved in the deep uncertainty, and you've obviously been discussing this at some length already. And the challenge, of course, is that in many instances, we need to take action now, but keep the long term in mind, with a view to having flexibility, keeping options open to adjust over time. We need to prioritize anticipatory action and avoid opening up new physical development in exposed localities. A third feature is the many transboundary challenges, whether it's in geographies, in policy and institutional arenas over time, etc. The challenge, of course, is to build linkages and networks of trust that enable legitimate decision-making across these boundary conditions, and also to build shared understanding through processes of social learning. A fourth condition has to do with how sea level rise is compounding coastal hazard risk that might arise through destruction of coastal ecosystems and various other processes that are rampant along many of the pressurized coastal zones of the world. And a challenge in the face of this escalating and compound complex risk is to prioritize the reduction of social vulnerability. What drives people to live in places exposed to these hazards and then be susceptible to harm? A flip side of that coin, one could say, is to build capability to enable enduring resilience. And finally, and this is picked up in several of the comments that Jochen made a moment ago around the exacerbating reality of coastal contestation, very confined, limited space, many demands, and the challenge to overcome that contestation is to involve stakeholders, especially vulnerable groups, early, consistently, in an enduring way, and to create what you might call safe arenas for engagement. In other words, those societal interactions can take place amongst all those governance actors in ways that enable difficult conversations to be held. That's ideal. So, translating this into a New Zealand context, from where you are, if you basically head south and just heading towards Antarctica and take a left, when you hit Australia, you'll find the islands of New Zealand. And on the North Island, I'm going to just draw on a couple of case studies in those circled areas, in the Hawke's Bay, the Coromandel, in two regions further to the west, in Taranaki and the Manawatu regions. We've got quite a lot of detail on this slide. I just want to make a couple of simple points around the importance of understanding history and context. New Zealand has been relatively recently colonized by comparison. A treaty between the Maori indigenous people and the colonizers, the British Crown essentially, was only took place in 1840, but it was probably some 120, 130 years before serious efforts were made to recognize and restore rights. That continues through to this day. So in essence, a bicultural nation with European settlers and Maori in this treaty and many other more recent migrants. And that shapes how conversations around the future of the shoreline and its development unfold. Quickly zeroing in on the Hawke's Bay and the Coromandel Peninsula, the Hawke's Bay has become quite iconic in the New Zealand context because of an effort to develop a 100-year strategy to manage coastal hazard risk in this region, about a 45-kilometer stretch of coast in that panel A, in that graph there. The Coromandel, very different context, not that far away, but I highlight this because in two regions relatively close by, very different stories have unfolded in addressing coastal hazard risk in a changing climate. Part of the energy and success of the work in the Hawke's Bay was framed by a co-design approach or co-creation approach. So a couple of quick take-home messages. Firstly, in terms of setting up this strategy for 100 years, it was the collaboration between district councils and regional councils and Maori tribes that was foundational for making meaningful progress on developing the strategy. A second key point was a research team that acted essentially as critical friends to this endeavor, working alongside in an action research approach to provide support and insight, leveraging understanding from international scholarship, as well as advisory work for the New Zealand government on developing guidance for coastal adaptation. Work done by consultants for the councils and the iwi was largely technically framed, and it was in part because of the intervention of the researchers that more focus on process and engagement of some of the more marginalized and exposed communities took a stronger focus, and an adaptation pathways logic became mapped onto some of the multi-criteria decision analysis that the consultants were driving. The challenge remains to turn the strategy into action. And of course, there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong in that shift. The Coromandel Peninsula is a very different story. A peninsula with a small bay and a rugged coastline, a very hilly coastline, and a complete set of contrasts from high-end luxury second homes through to very rural, quite remote and disconnected Maori families and extended families along parts of this coastline. So a couple of observations quickly on the Coromandel Peninsula. You can have a situation where literally neighboring communities might as well be worlds apart in terms of their perceived sense of risk, their understanding of climate change, and what they perceive as appropriate responses. Local leadership, particularly through the mayor of the main district here, has changed dramatically over time, literally going from quite progressive and forward-thinking leadership to climate denialism. And so a real change over time as one mayor is replaced by another. In the process, efforts by the council to advance adaptation from the vantage point of some are seen to be a serious, meaningful effort. Others perceive it as a veneer, as a superficial band-aid solution, and even leading to protests, civil disobedience, litigation, and so on. So the point here is, depending on your circumstance and where you sit in the peninsula and what exposure you have and what worldview you have, the struggle to adapt is indeed a struggle. I won't spend much time elaborating here. This is a new project that's been underway for about a year, working with 4 communities in the Manawatu and Taranaki regions. And these are highly exposed and highly vulnerable communities. And this project is seeking to unravel the interconnections between those formal and informal institutional arrangements. What are the views of Maori in some of these communities relative to the regulatory responsibilities and provisions at district, regional, and national level? How do these interactions play out? What are the barriers and enablers to advancing efforts to reduce risk, including vulnerability? So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pause with in the last couple of points here around some high-level observations drawing from this work, essentially over the last 15 to 20 years. The treaty is a foundational document and means and way of doing governance in New Zealand. Its delivery remains an ongoing struggle. History matters. There is major new legislative reform underway of the entire planning system, including the introduction of a Climate Adaptation Act. Unfortunately, it will only come into being probably a year from now after an election. That election has the potential to essentially see that adaptation law reform end up on the rocks, as it were, if we have a conservative government come into power, which is possible. And nonetheless, there's robust institutional architecture. We've even got a national adaptation plan in place. But one of the critical questions is who pays for actions like major new protection works. There's a formula, essentially, it's a user pays logic. But when it comes to managed retreat, it is yet to be decided what contribution government, the general taxpayer, is going to make relative to regional and local taxpayers, residents and insurance and so forth. So real uncertainty about resolving the who pays question. In practice, one can see vestiges of response-based planning in many parts of the coast. There's often a predominance of technical framing, high reliance on protection, despite regulatory provisions to the contrary, and ongoing pressure to build right on the seashore. To compound matters, at the local level, particularly in the more remote localities, there's tremendous adaptation capacity need still to be built. The lessons that are being learned, whether it's through research, whether it's through local experience in communities, whether it's local knowledge or indigenous knowledge, are filtering up and down really, really slowly. And so lastly, the observation that I've made, even with a very good governance system in a place like New Zealand, enabling and empowering governance is in fact a deep struggle. And it's a struggle to overcome historical and contemporary inequities and injustices and entrenched marginalization, where deep division exists, especially by remote Maori communities in New Zealand. Thank you very much. I'll end, if you want to read, this is a Maori proverb. In response to the question, what is the most important thing in the world? The answer, they say, it is the people, it is the people, it is the people. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for really a very insightful talk and a very vivid picture of the kind of institutional structure and different levels of governance that are, important in coming forward with this challenge. I'd say we have time for one question. We're a little bit behind. If anyone would like to pose a question, please come to the microphone. Yes, Nadia.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring presentation. My question is a bit more philosophical. I got in my work to think about contradictory statements between sustainability and resilience. Sometimes sustainability works a bit against resilience, especially the people's vulnerability solutions. Do you have any thought about this?
Bruce, can you speak to that, please? The contradictions between vulnerability on one hand and how that leads to resilience building, or not, if I got the question right. Again, we're having audio, we don't hear you. Do you want to have another go at that, or shall we move on then, I think? In any case, it was a very helpful talk. Thanks very much, Bruce. Perhaps there's some other way to respond to that question. Thank you. I will move to the next speaker. apologize for the audio difficulties there. Our next speaker is Lisa Devignol from the Cities Initiative, and she will speak about the Ocean and Climate Platform. So thank you very much, Lisa.
Hi everyone, and thank you for this introduction. So my name is Lisa Devignol. I work for the Ocean and Climate Platform that is leading the Cities Initiative, and that's what I'm going to present today. I will try to add to the excellent presentations that we just had. So I'll present the initiative, and then I'll explain how we thrive to add to the conversation and to enable adaptation through scientific knowledge combined with community visioning. But just before diving into this, just to give you an idea of who we are as an organization, we're an NGO, so our positioning is quite different from that of scientists. Our core objective is to facilitate and to promote the exchange of information and reflection between the scientific community, between civil society and political decision makers. We do that with our network of 100 members engaged in a variety of topics related to ocean, climate, and biodiversity nexus. So we mobilize those members on their areas of expertise. We contribute with them to developing and sharing and disseminating scientific knowledge, and we work on producing recommendations and advocacy at international, regional, and local level. And in that context, when the IPCC special report on the ocean and the cryosphere in a changing climate was produced, we contributed to its review in France with our network. And that's when the topic emerged for us and our members, and we decided to tackle it and contribute to this scene. So we decided to work with medium-sized cities in particular on the basis that they tend to have lower financial means, they don't necessarily have the same in-house technical capacities, so those are the cities that we work with the most. And the overarching objective of this work is to collectively, with those cities and with other stakeholders involved, to facilitate the development and the implementation of adaptation policies that will be just for coastal communities and also other communities that are a bit more inland and removed from immediate coastal threats, but who will be concerned in the future. And so we look at 5 different regions of the world: Northern Europe, the Mediterranean Basin, the US West Coast, West Africa, and the South Pacific. And what we do is we try to look at how things are done in each of these regions and see how that can inform adaptation within the region, and also how we can share knowledge, perspectives, innovations in between those regions. So collectively, we come together with mayors, with practitioners, with artists, with students, with NGOs, with all actors, students, all actors involved in this work, and we produce knowledge that is not exclusively scientific, that is not top-down, but that incorporates the different experiences and lived experiences of decision makers and other stakeholders involved in this field. So the first step in doing this is about gathering and synthesizing scientific information, and that stems from an observation that data availability and access is uneven across the different regions that we work in, and that's also the case in Europe. And in Europe in particular, because this is the region that we're discussing in this conference, there is substantial information. Of course, there are gaps that remain, but there is information out there. However, cities don't always know how to access it. They're not always aware that it even exists. And when they can access it, it can be hard to make sense of, and it can be hard to navigate because there is a profusion of sources, a profusion of networks, a profusion of platforms as well. So it can be hard for local authorities to refer to one type of information and not the other, and to action all that information. So in line with this observation we got with the French National Center for Scientific Research, and we built this international multidisciplinary thematic network where we gather with scientists working across different disciplines, and we try to produce or to translate knowledge, to change the language that it has so that it can be actioned, so that it can be used for accessing funding, for developing guidelines, for monitoring over time. And so through this work, through this group, we have produced a scientific synthesis last year about the governance modalities typically associated with different types of adaptation responses. We also support a PhD student who works on nature-based solutions for coastal adaptation in the Mediterranean region. And we also work on producing popular science videos so that the information can be accessed by as many people as possible, including people who don't work at all in this field, including people who aren't coastal population at all. But this is not enough for local authorities. Robust science is not enough. And it needs to be combined with real life experience. And that means success stories, but also failures, also challenges that remain. And that's something that till this day is really hard to convey and to exchange in between cities, because surprisingly, cities don't often talk with each other outside of the existing networks, and there are a number of excellent networks. But it remains hard for them to access this experience, this database of experiences. So we started with an online tool, the Map of Solutions, which is by no means exhaustive, but it aims at capturing the plurality of existing adaptation responses with information regarding the cost of these solutions, how many years it took to implement, which partners were involved, so that to inspire other local authorities into developing their own solutions that will fit their territory. This is still not enough, so it's a first step. But to access more detailed information and also to enable cities to talk about their failures, we also organize regional workshops. So far, we've held 4 out of 5. The photos are from one of our last workshops last September in Santa Cruz, California. And so in those workshops, typically we gather between 20 and 60 people from very different fields. So of course still mayors, governors, other kind of elected representatives, representative of networks, of certain private sectors, but also scientists, of course, and as many people as we can in these groups. And through this discussion, we analyze the situation in the region in terms of what solutions are deployed, how they work, how they articulate with each other. And on that basis, we produce those reports. So the first one was produced earlier this year on challenges and best practices in Northern Europe. The second one on the Mediterranean region will be published in a couple of days, so this is a super exclusive image of the cover. And all this work informs the recommendations that we produce collectively. And I'd like to insist on this collective aspect of the production. And so a first kind of deliverable in this advocacy line of work was a declaration, the city's declaration that we launched earlier this year in February. And so far it's been signed by over 30 mayors and governors representing over 40 coastal municipalities across the world. So what this tells us is that there is a real need from local authorities who want to get involved but just don't know how to access the knowledge and also the returns on experience that they need. And just to give you an idea regarding our next steps with the initiative, based on the advocacy and based on all the recommendations, as well as the best practices that we're currently collecting, we are working on developing regional pilot projects with coastal cities. And so we're exploring at the moment options in California and in West Africa on how to support cities, whether it be financially, whether it be through knowledge, whether it be through expertise, into implementing these recommendations and developing their own adaptation plan. So we're still learning a lot. This is an initiative that's only 2 years old, so we're young, we're learning. But there's already a lot of findings that came of these convenings. There's, of course, a lot more enablers to take into consideration, including funding, financing, adaptation, but I'm not going to focus on that today. So the first one that we've been discussing so much over the last 2 days is about the knowledge, and it's been incredible to have all these presentations very much focused on the science, but not being a scientist and working with people who aren't necessarily scientists either, it occupies me quite a bit to make sure that the information that is out there and that already exists gets used. So we work in this kind of transdisciplinary manner and integrate knowledge that isn't necessarily scientific, as I've said earlier. And depending on the region, that can include local knowledge, kind of historical experience, lived experience. That can include indigenous knowledge. That can also include the contribution of citizens in the production of data. And this kind of information tends to be super relevant at local scale. And this is the knowledge that local authorities are after, locally relevant knowledge. And that includes social metrics. And this is particularly useful to access funding. Another point, another key enabler has to do with the institutional arrangements, because there's always different layers of governance, different layers of decision makers involved. And having knowledge at hand that is locally relevant can support the development of frameworks that are scaled and that will enable the development of locally relevant ways to assess success, ways to monitor solutions and how they evolve over time, and ways to potentially switch to new strategies to adapt in the future. And all of this, and that's probably going to be the point that I want to stress the most, has to be deeply, deeply inclusive of citizens and communities that inhabit coastal cities. Because if we really think about adaptation, it's not just about preserving infrastructures, preserving assets, or moving assets. It's about the people, as Bruce said. And if we want to give rise to adaptation solutions that work in the long term, we need to integrate communities and include them in deciding what happens on their territory, in designing the future that they want. So to do that, it seems pretty simple, really. Engagement, that's something we've heard for a long time, but it's still not being done so much. And actually, engaging communities is not just about consulting them with a pretty much ready plan, or even simply just asking them in the beginning of the process, okay, what is it that matters to you? It's truly about forming new ways of governing a territory, integrating the communities throughout the entire process. And that is difficult, that takes time, but that also takes money. And I'd like to stress that, because this is a cost that is practically always overlooked. But community engagement in the long run is very expensive, and that's something that is not necessarily accounted for in funding opportunities. And I'll probably end it on that because time is kicking. But I think we should look at engaging communities into producing knowledge, into deciding what happens to them on their territory, because communities are reclaiming this right to decide for themselves. and consider adaptation as an opportunity to create cities that are more fair, that are more equitable, that are just nicer places to live. And so justice can be a legacy of adaptation if it's managed and anticipated as it should be. So I'll stop it there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be happy to take any question, but I just want to reassert that we're really trying through this initiative to gather as many people as possible who are interested and involved in this work. And of course that encompasses scientists as well. So please do reach out, please get in touch. We very much welcome any inputs in recommendation, production, or for the pilot project. So please, feel free to reach out and to have a chat afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. It's a very nice presentation, a really clear view on that initiative and the kind of conditions for success and engagement. In interest of time, I think we shall move on to the panel, and we'll come back for a Q&A if we have time after the panel. So I'd like to invite our 4 panelists to come up, plus one joining remotely. We have actually quite a packed panel this morning, very nice mix of policymakers, private sector, also funders and philanthropic organizations. So please make your way to the front. So, thanks very much. So we're moving into the panel discussion section of this session. I would like to give each of the panelists a chance to introduce themselves and their activities on addressing sea level rise. And also, I mean, if I can start actually with you, Daria, Povh, from UNEP MAP. Please, introduce a bit of your activities to do a sea level rise. And I would also like to hear a bit, kind of following up on some of the issues around governance and engagement that we've heard. If you could speak to the question of what you see as kind of the factors for success in engagement, in engaging communities or moving forward, advancing the work on adaptation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. So I am Daria Skugor from Paperak, which is a part of Mediterranean Action Plan, a regional C of the United Nations Environment Programme. So we have been practicing coastal area management programs for more than 4 decades. And we have been trying in the integrated approach to tackle the priorities which we found as coastal issues in the locations where we worked. And after 4 decades of practicing these coastal area management programs, we understood that we need more than the project kind of approach. And that's how all Mediterranean countries decided together to prepare the protocol on integrated coastal zone management. It took us 7 years to prepare this text together with all Mediterranean countries, with many expert groups, meetings, forums, discussions that we got to that document, which is still today only regional legal document on ICZM in the world. So today I would like to mention 2 articles of this protocol which are important for this work, and this is Article 8, so-called flagship article of our protocol, the one that caused us the most troubles, and this is the so-called setback protocol, or the one which is inviting all Mediterranean countries to establish a setback zone near the sea where the construction will not be allowed. This protocol, of course, allows also exemptions, and actually it puts the game into the court of the national governments, but it says you need to establish the rules of the construction in the narrow coastal lands. Another important article is Article 16, which is inviting countries to prepare national strategies and coastal plans. So this protocol came into force in 2013, and since then we have helped to prepare 4 national strategies. But the situation was very interesting also with the coastal plans. The first coastal plan, which was founded on the protocol, was prepared in 2013 up to 2015. And in 2016, this coastal plan was adopted by the regional council, and by that it became a legal document for that county, which is a Šibenik-Knin county in Croatia. And the plan was awarded later on in 2019 with the Med Award. We were very lucky that during the preparation of the coastal plan, we also had the implementation of the DIVA assessment of the potential cost from sea level rise in Croatia. And I don't know exactly what was the reason, but since then we have 5 coastal plans in Croatia. So our most well-known oceanographer keeps on repeating the cost of the sea level rise, which was calculated in 2015, still today at every symposium, conference, and the TV interview he has, and he had many TV interviews. So today we have 5 coastal plans in Croatia, and only one was prepared by Paprak. There are 2 which were funded by the regions themselves, and 3 were funded by different EU projects. So, well, of course, in our approach, as I said, we always work in the integrative manner, and we are very keen into the participation and actually engagement. And through the development of these plans and projects, we actually want to build and good conditions for establishing governance. So this is for us the only way that we see that really something can be changed on the territory. So I had questions which were sent to me. Shall I reply to these questions?
Let's get a statement each from the panelists, and we'll come back to that.
Okay.
I hear that the cost issue and benefits from adaptation is important in driving this engagement. But let's move then to Sylvie. Sylvie Goyet from the Prince Albert Foundation. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a long name. My name is Sylvie Goyet. I represent Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. Now, this is a private foundation, so you wonder a bit what the hell is she doing here? Now, the foundation, and there's not too many foundations, we're not a funder. We are a foundation that was set up about 15 years ago by the sovereign prince. Now, we are both a granting organization and an operational organization. We do support projects in the field, such as the Cities project we just heard, or we do as well operate as well and use our influence. When I say our influence, it's not mine, of course. We're fortunate to be presided by a head of state, the Prince Albert II, who is also extremely committed to championing ocean and climate. So we kind of use that vehicle to carry a lot of influence. So in short, our 3 pillars are basically we build on science, and we're renowned for building on science, whether it's through championing the special report on ocean and climate, which Monaco and the foundation did propose, first to IPCC, whether it's in convening scientific experts in Monaco or other places. We do build on science. That's our first pillar. Our second is, and I would like to say, just increasingly over the past few years, we've been looking at nexus approaches. We've been looking at breaking silos. We've been looking at championing ocean, but in the context of climate change, championing biodiversity and nature-based solutions in the context of adaptation. So we're looking at these nexus approaches. We recently convened an ocean and health conference in Monaco. We do regularly convene different stakeholders looking at issues. Last year we had a Sea and the City conference, almost Sex and the City, almost. Sea and the City conference, bringing local authorities, bringing different stakeholders to look at this interface between ocean and land, which is of particular importance to IPCC especially. Third, I'd say we do focus on action. How do we get things done? I mentioned influence. We at the Foundation, we've been pushing and championing the integration of ocean in the climate dialogue, UNFCCC, COPs, through various initiatives because the ocean are others. So we've been pushing to really integrate the ocean, mainstreaming it into some of the main key dialogues on climate, on BBNG, on biodiversity. Second, and we heard it earlier, we think the narratives is important. We think it's extremely complex, and we heard it from the speakers just before us. It is extremely complex, and it is extremely complex to understand and then to convey to the decision makers. So we believe the narratives, the stories are important. So we're focusing quite a bit of effort on communication, on the explanation, the capturing the essence of what it is, to really work a lot on that. And a third pillar, I'd say, is on action. And on action, we do prioritize, I'd say, innovation. We're launching an Ocean Innovators platform. We're going to have a meeting in March on this. So innovation is important. How can we as a foundation, we have the ability, unlike other of my colleagues, to really take risks, to challenge. We don't have the same accountability as maybe UNEP MAP or some other institutions. So we have a great capacity to take risks and to challenge. So we do that. Innovation is important to us in all fields, technical, social, all fields. Second, I'd say demonstration is important. So we don't, influence on a global scale, but action is usually on a local scale. We support demonstration in the field in various aspects. We've been spearheading the Global Fund for Coral Reef, a blended finance approach to coral reef. We're looking at demonstration on nature-based solutions, which we call no-regret solutions. So we've been pushing some of this demonstration in the field. And finally, we focus on collaboration. It's almost like the how did he say? He tangate. We focus as well on collaboration. I'll stop here just to give
Great, thank you very much. I mean, several activities that are extremely relevant for the Knowledge Hub in terms of communication, but also thinking about how to fund different initiatives or demonstrations, interventions that also are relevant for adaptation. Maybe we'll come back to that a bit later in the panel. I'd like to now move on to Giovanni. And again, I mean, so the idea of engagement is, and the importance of engagement is clearly coming through, and we have experiences on that. So speaking to what kind of, we know that we need to engage early, but other aspects of what drives successful engagement, this would be interesting to hear from your perspective, Giovanni. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Giovanni Coppini. I work at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, where I'm director of a division dealing with the ocean prediction and application. And I work also in the Copernicus Marine Service for the Mediterranean and Black Sea. So let's say I'm in a team that produce information, products and information using, of course, observation, so using model. And I think I've been in the last years, now decade, in the nice position where we tend to advance in science, but at the same time we try to develop science that serve society. And what I've learned, let's say, staying in contact with the stakeholders and users is that, first of all, you need to understand needs. And that's it has always been the driving starting point, or the starting point. So I've experienced in the past and also today, regional agencies dealing with, they have to do the new adaptation plan for their coastal areas. So the first, they could grab information from, let's say, from the web, from the general reports, from the IPCC general information, but then in the years, they have understood that they need more accurate information. And this is a need that has driven our science to also to identify funding for increasing the complexity of our modeling and observing capacity. And that's why today we are dealing with a very complex downscaling system. Is not only for scientific purpose, but it's really because the user at the local and sub-regional scale, coastal scale, they need to take into account the river, the wave, the ocean circulation and sea level, and then they want to see the consequence on the ecosystem, on coastal erosion. So if you really try to understand their need, then as a consequence, you can shape your science so that it provide more accurate information. Of course, these apply also to other, even we were discussing this morning or citing aquaculture. I mean, aquaculture, to me, 5 years ago, was nothing to do with sea level rise. Today, basically, their main worry is about extreme events, and we know the linkage between the sea level rise and the frequency of extreme events. And today they are one of the most important target users that drive our science for early warning system, of course, together with flooding and erosion. Collaboration, I totally agree, is a key to progress, not only collaboration between science and stakeholders and users, but also international, national and international collaboration among different communities and scientific communities. And I think the Ocean Decade today gives us a great opportunity. Today we have the Cost Predict, among the others, the Cost Predict program, and within then we have today several endorsed decade action. One of them is called Predict on Time to improve our capacity of observing and predicting forecasting the extreme events. The other one is on climate downscaling. So I think today we have the opportunity of enlarging, for my experience, from the European dimension of research and going to the international. And the other challenge that comes for free with that is that now we have to deal with stakeholders that are not that we don't know, because they are, let's say, stakeholders from Africa, from South America. So it's really fascinating. It's really, and we're learning a lot through this collaboration with scientific community and stakeholder community from other countries. That's the first.
Great. No, thank you. That's also a common theme coming through these interventions. Maybe we'll move now to Christelle Castet from AXA. This also gives us a different perspective from the private sector. And again, it would be interesting to hear your activities, but also what kind of drives engagement and interest from, as I understand, the private sector actors that you're working with. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I work at AXA Climate, which is, you probably know AXA is a big insurer, and AXA Climate is an entity of about 120 people that firmly believes in adaptation and in a way to reduce risk and adaptation and also training. Maybe I can speak about the obvious impact of sea level rise on an insurer. For instance, you have the last tropical cyclone Ian that caused about 60 billion damages in Florida. We know that by 2050, there will be probably 1 trillion damages annually caused by coastal risk. So this is an obvious fact that we have taken into account, and that's important for AXA Climate to tackle. So one way to deal with this is with parametric insurance. And with parametric insurance, it's an index-based insurance that aims at covering this extreme hazard, like coastal floods. And we have to understand better how this coastal flood will be reduced with, will increase because of climate change and sea level rise. Like, for instance, we heard about centennial event, 1 in a 100-year event becoming maybe yearly events in the future. And this is a need for data that we have. We also have to include chronic risk now. We understand that sea level rise is a slowly evolving thing that will impact people worldwide, communities, companies. And so we have built on top of parametric insurance a consulting team that aims at better explaining to communities and our clients also the risk. And for consulting, we have large questions regarding coastal risk. We can have people asking questions because they are in the tourism industry and they wonder how coastal erosion might damage their businesses in the future. And data set like the one from Delta Res yesterday on coastal erosion is very useful for us. All the scientific talks were useful, so I shouldn't pick and choose. But anyways, there is another question that can arise about if you're a big agricultural firm and you're asking question about land salination and what's the impact and how to adapt to this risk. Also, you could have a company that really highly depends, its supply chain depends on the ports and the port activity for supplies, and they have to also see how do I adapt? How can I limit my business interruption because of future sea level rise and coastal erosion or coastal flooding? So these are all the questions we try to answer with our consulting activity. And I'll leave it to this for now.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I mean, clearly a kind of economic rationale there driving engagement. Before we move to the Q&A, then I will ask our last panelist who is joining remotely, Emilia Pistrika from the European Investment Bank. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Please, if you could, give us some insight into EIB activities addressing sea level rise adaptation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you for having me even remotely here today with you. Thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me all well.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, conscious of the time constraints, I hope today I will be able to communicate you some basic but very ambitious climate targets and commitments that we in the European Investment Bank has set long time ago, but the last 3 years as the new EU Climate Bank, we really work hard on achieving those targets. So let me start from there, or maybe even like very few words about what is the European Investment Bank. The European Investment Bank since 1958 is the lending arm of the European Union. We are the biggest multilateral lender in the world, and we are leading the climate finance. We're, let's say, one of the leading providers of climate finance. We are 3,500 people at the headquarters based in Luxembourg, and we also operate in over 50 offices around the world. Now, in 2019, the European Investment Bank set these 3 very specific targets regarding the climate action and environmental sustainability. The first one is to achieve by 2025
more than 50% of our lending volumes to go to investments that contribute significantly to climate action and environmental sustainability. The second one is to support 1 trillion of green finance by the end of 2030, so in this decade. And the third one is to make sure that all our activities are Paris aligned. In order to do that, we of course made it all the teams in the bank, we are not only finance professionals, we also have, as I am, engineers, environmental and social experts, are involved, and economists. And all the teams work in this direction to achieve these targets. One more thing that I would like to mention is especially for the adaptation finance, because we do see how the increasing investment need globally especially on adaptation finance. We announced last year that for adaptation, I guess you already know that adaptation finance, it only now, these days, it's only 14%, represents only a 14% of the global climate finance. So the bank announced last year that we will try by 2025 to have a 15% dedicated of our EIB financing only to adaptation. And that said, we also focusing now a lot on ensuring that our investments, at least as I said, 50% of our investments would be also contributing to environmental sustainability, meaning that we try to focus more on nature positive investments, such as the nature-based solutions that I heard a lot this morning and also yesterday from participants in the conference. Now, a clear example why the participation of someone from EIB would be relevant here is very few things that I would like to mention on what we are doing with the blue economy related activities. We in the EIB since 2018 we have the EIB Clean and Sustainable Oceans program. Basically is comprised by two initiatives. One is the Clean Ocean Initiative, which is focusing more on reducing pollution in the oceans, focus especially on plastics. And the other one that I would like to mention here more, which is more relevant, is the Blue Sustainable Ocean Strategy, the Blue SOS, that focuses on 4 sectors: the coastal protection, sustainable coastal protection and ecosystem preservation, the sustainable seafood production, that is the fisheries and aquaculture, the ocean observation technologies and services, and the fourth one is the green shipping. What also can I say? Just to say that the good news from our part is that we managed in 2021, at the end of 2021, to already have the share of EIB investment that go to climate action and environmental sustainability to already rose to 51%. And in the water sector, because I work in the water sector, we are at the contributing around 1/3 of the total EIB adaptation finance, which this basically translates to around 1.4 billion that we would like to, as I said in the beginning, multiply this to around 10 billion by the end of 2025. Thank you for your attention. Looking forward for the QA.
Great, thanks very much. Clearly, there's a need to have good decision making, backing the allocation of those resources. I mean, in terms of decision making now, we're a little bit into past our time. But I still think it's important to have a Q&A with the panelists. We'll I'd like to leave another 5 minutes or so for that into your lunch break. So please, I would like to invite any members of the audience to pose questions to our panelists here. We've heard a kind of diversity of views from sort of policy and influencing policy through engagement, also a scientific perspective on how to design that, as well as some sort of funders and funding decisions on which activities to fund to support this. Yes, please, Bart.
I want to take you too long from your lunch, but both for Christelle and Emilia, I'm wondering what are the main bottlenecks for you to decide whether your investments or your insurance portfolio are actually meeting your climate resilience goals. Can you just list a few bottlenecks, and preferably those where we as a scientific community could assist? And maybe first Emilia, yeah?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, it's a very good question. Thank you for giving the opportunity to answer to that. So 3 words. Verification, monitoring, and impact reporting. Starting from the verification, and for us, so in order to streamline it to integrate it in the projects that we finance, all these that I mentioned in my introduction is that we have already a climate risk assessment tool fully integrated in our internal processes. This is how we try to manage the physical risk assessment in our EIB finance projects. And how does this work? Basically, we follow a 3-step approach. First of all is a clear identification of the climate vulnerabilities within the project area, and that should be backed up with scientific evidence. So the bottleneck that we are having there is good quality climate risk vulnerability assessments that our clients need to produce for us to review. And that would mean, if we go one step back, that would mean that we need reference points such as sea level rise predictions, future shoreline predictions, that can work for us as a reference point, so as to verify to make sure that to verify the quality of the CRVA that we're receiving. The step 2 of this systematic approach that we try to use for all the project to screen in and assess is concerns the adaptive capacity of the promoter. So we need to ensure that the promoter has the willingness, but not only the willingness, but also the strategy and the planning in place to implement the adaptation that he claims that he would like to do for the next years. And the 3rd step is clearly to link the project components that we are about to finance with what has been already identified as climate vulnerabilities of the project area. Having said on this, we are having bottlenecks and barriers also with our impact reporting and the monitoring requirements that we are planning to have in a project when we are not having, for example, the best quality, we haven't received, for example, the best quality climate risk assessment climate risk vulnerability assessment report that we would expect to. To give you an example, for example, we have appraised relatively recently a project of coastal erosion along the Black Sea in Romania. That was around 100 million euro loan, and that was basically EIB's financing the state contribution, the Romanian's contribution to a very big investment project that is hugely financed by EU grants. And this coastal erosion project, which concerns over 30 kilometers of beach nourishment and comes also with biodiversity enhancement measures, because we're talking about a very sensitive sensitive coastal environment that includes Nature 2000 areas and freshwater lakes. We're talking about the Delta of Danube. And has been severely deteriorated the last decades. So for this project, what we received as a climate risk vulnerability assessment was not, let's say that it was a bit outdated. So the sea level prediction that I had there was only based on extrapolation of a past trend. They were missing the climate and uncertainty and the scenarios. But we, after careful consideration, we accepted to finance this project, but having incorporated in the project monitoring special conditions on how to establish a monitoring program on beach maintenance and biodiversity impacts. So we follow, the bank follows it closely year by year to see the results of this monitoring. And moreover, we have paid attention that there are built-in adaptation measures included in this type of project so as to ensure flexibility and space, let's say, to the promoter to alter the design to build in on the knowledge gained by the monitoring program.
Thank you. We're back to a bit on the issue of flexibility and designing that into to projects. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Maybe I'll add to this for AXA Climate. So the bottleneck, we have to run cost-benefit analysis. In our opinion, to make things move in the right direction, we need to put a price on the risk and also on the adaptation solution to be able to help prioritize solutions. So it's quite important. We like to push nature-based solution, for instance, because in our opinion, adaptation measure have to be holistic. They have to include benefits for maybe carbon uptake, for society, for also obviously reducing risk, and for ecosystem. And it's quite hard right now to be able to put a price on this kind of adaptation measure, but we're kind of happy to be able to propose some insurance solution because adaptation options take a long time, and especially nature-based solution, we have been able to put in place insurance of coral reef, for instance. Coral reef that reduce the risk for coastal community, but we still need to better understand the benefits of this adaptation measure for the blue economy, and so we need partnerships basically with research and academia on all these topics.
Thanks. Yep, please, Giovanni.
Just a very brief comment. I strongly agree with Emilia and Christelle, and I think this community is, of course, with the with the large variety of scientific capacity, is able today to define the new methodologies for climate downscaling and maybe better risk adaptation, risk assessment. But also, what we are doing today is planning carefully the landscape or the project of nature-based solution. Because in the past we have seen that you can build hard work or nature-based solution that then fail because they were not properly planning, and then the investment and the cost will be higher. For instance, now we are starting, not as big as the Black Sea project, but we are starting a few million projects in Civitavecchia, and in which we will be planning with the models and with the observation, let's say, what we think is the optimal landscape for the ecosystem restoration, and then we will monitor. So I think today this community is ready to propose to the investors the best methodologies to plan these adaptation strategies.
Thanks very much. I'm very apologies to all the further questions. I think we have to stop. This has been a very rich session that's covered a lot of ground, from decision making to politics and to funding decisions. So I'd like to thank very much all of our panelists and our keynote speakers, and thank you to the audience as well. Thanks very much.